My sister handed me my seating card at her wedding rehearsal on the evening of Friday, June 6th, and she smiled at me across the table at the country club dining room in Charleston, South Carolina. The card said Table 19. I looked at the seating chart on the wall behind her. Table 19 was in the back corner of the ballroom. Table 19 was next to the emergency exit. Table 19 was the table where the bride's mother had placed the college friends her daughter had barely stayed in touch with, the two coworkers she'd felt obligated to invite, and, I realized as I read the small handwritten list, me, the bride's only sister, her only sister, seated at table 19, while the seat directly to the right of the bride at the head table, the seat that had, by 3 centuries of Southern wedding tradition, always been reserved for the maid of honor, or the bride's closest family, had been assigned to a woman I had never met, a woman named Ashley Ford, my sister's best friend from her sorority at Vanderbilt, whom my sister had known for 6 years. I had been my sister's sister for 32 years. I put the card in my purse. I did not say anything, because I already knew what the groom's family did not know. The sisters. My name is Grace Bellamy. I am 32 years old. I live in Alexandria, Virginia, in a small brick townhouse I bought 2 years ago with money I earned myself. I work, and this matters for the story, as a Foreign Service officer with the United States Department of State, currently on temporary assignment to a policy directorate that I am not going to describe on this recording. My sister is Caroline Bellamy. She is 29. She was, until the afternoon of June 7th, engaged to a man named Preston Whitfield. Preston is 34. He is a corporate attorney at a firm in downtown Charleston. His family, I need you to understand this part, has been in Charleston since 1798. Preston's father is Judge Harrison Whitfield of the South Carolina Court of Appeals. His mother is Eleanor Cabot Whitfield, of the Cabot family of Beaufort. His grandmother, when she was alive, was on the board of the historic Charleston Foundation for 41 years. When my sister met Preston at a mutual friend's engagement party in early 2023, my mother, Diana Bellamy, called me in Washington and said, in the voice she reserves for the most important moments of her life, "Grace, Caroline has met the Whitfields." She said the name Whitfield the way some people say the name Kennedy. I want to explain the difference between my sister and me because it is the entire story. Caroline is beautiful. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. She is the kind of beautiful that opens doors, gets forgiven for lateness, and is described by strangers as striking. She is also, and I love her, I want to be clear that I love my sister. She is also, and has been since we were children, the kind of person who understood, very early, that beauty was a currency and that the family bank account had, when we were growing up, been running perpetually low. Our father, Thomas Bellamy, died when I was 12 and Caroline was 9. He was a Marine Corps pilot. He was killed in a training accident off the coast of North Carolina in the spring of 2005. My mother was 38. She had never worked. She had married my father at 22, and she had, for 16 years, been an officer's wife, moving from base to base, hosting the wing commander's Christmas parties, running the family readiness group at Cherry Point. When my father died, my mother did what many women of her generation and her upbringing did. She looked, first, for another husband, and when that did not immediately produce results, she looked, second, for a daughter who might. Caroline was that daughter. I was not. I was, from the age of 12 onward, the daughter my mother left in the kitchen with the dishes while she took Caroline shopping. I was the daughter who was told, in various ways over various years, that I was the smart one and that smart girls go far, always in a tone that made it clear that far meant away from home and that smart was a consolation for what I was not. I went to William and Mary on an Roth scholarship because my father had left a small survivor benefit and my mother had made it clear that whatever was in it was for Caroline's future. I graduated in 2015. I did 4 years as an Army logistics officer. I applied to the State Department in 2019. I passed the Foreign Service Officer test in 2020. I have been posted, since then, to Riga, Bogota, and, for the last 11 months, Washington. My sister, meanwhile, went to Vanderbilt. My mother took out a home equity loan to pay for it. Caroline pledged Kappa Alpha Theta. She majored in art history. She graduated in 2018 and moved home to Charleston, where my mother had, 4 years earlier, moved after selling our house in Virginia Beach. Because my mother had, in her words, always wanted to live in Charleston, and the schools were better for Caroline. I did not begrudge my sister any of it. I want to make that clear. I love Caroline. I have loved Caroline since the day my father brought her home from the hospital in 1996, and I sat on the couch and touched her small pink hand. Whatever my mother had done, whatever preferences she had made, whatever daughters she had chosen, my sister had not asked for it. My sister was, in her own way, a victim of the arrangement too, but something began to change when Caroline got engaged. I first noticed it in June of last year, at Caroline's engagement party at the Whitfield family home on Meeting Street. I flew down from Washington. I brought a bottle of champagne and a small silver picture frame. I wore a navy blue dress from Talbot's that I had bought on sale. I arrived at 7 p.m. Caroline did not introduce me to Preston's parents. I want you to understand what that means. Judge Whitfield and Eleanor Whitfield were, that night, hosting 80 people in their home. They were greeting every guest personally at the door. When I walked in, Caroline was standing next to Eleanor, wearing a pale pink cocktail dress. She turned. She saw me. She smiled. She said, "Oh, Eleanor, I want you to meet—" "Oh, actually, Eleanor, let me introduce you to the Vanderbilt girls first. They just got here." She walked Eleanor Whitfield across the room to a cluster of women in their late 20s. I stood in the entryway for approximately 40 seconds. A woman I did not know, a caterer, I realized later, handed me a glass of champagne. I found my mother in the sunroom. My mother said, "Grace, honey, you made it. Caroline is so busy. Have you tried the crab dip?" I did not meet Judge Whitfield or Eleanor Whitfield that night. I flew back to Washington the next morning. That was 12 months before the wedding. The rehearsal. The wedding was set for Saturday, June 7th of this year. St. Michael's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston at 4 p.m. Reception at the Country Club of Charleston at 6 p.m. 240 guests. I flew down from Washington on Friday, June 6th, on a 6:45 a.m. flight from Reagan National. I checked into a small hotel on King Street. I attended the rehearsal at St. Michael's at 3 p.m. Caroline was late. I sat in the third pew for 45 minutes waiting for my sister to arrive. The wedding planner, a woman named Vivienne Duquesne, 60 years old, silver bob, black linen dress, worked the room. She introduced herself to Preston's family. She introduced herself to the officiant. You did not introduce herself to me. When Caroline finally arrived, at 3:47 p.m., she walked directly to Eleanor Whitfield. She kissed her on both cheeks. She said, loud enough for the entire church to hear, "Eleanor, I'm so sorry we're late. Preston had a call?" She then walked to Preston, kissed him, and turned to the wedding planner. She did not walk over to me. I want to be careful here about what I am describing, because I know how it sounds. I know that a bride is allowed to be distracted at her wedding rehearsal. I know that a bride is allowed to be nervous. I know that a bride is allowed to greet her future in-laws before she greets her own sister. But Caroline did not greet me at all during the rehearsal. She did not greet me when she walked in. She did not greet me during the ceremony walkthrough. She did not greet me during the discussion of the processional order, a discussion in which Vivienne Duquesne, referring to a printed list, said, "And Caroline, your sister, Grace. She's not in the bridal party. Is she seated with the family?" Caroline said, "Vivienne, we'll figure out where Grace sits at dinner. Let's focus on the actual ceremony." Vivienne moved on. I sat in the third pew and I watched my sister discuss her wedding without ever, once, turning her head in my direction. At 5:30 p.m., the rehearsal ended. We drove to the country club for the rehearsal dinner, and it was there, at the country club, at the check-in table, where Vivienne Duquesne handed out seating cards for the dinner, that Caroline finally spoke to me. She handed me my seating card. She said, "Grace, honey, we thought this year we'd try something new with the seating. Preston's family is so particular about tables at these things, and Vivienne said the family table works best when it's kept to immediate family only, which, we're defining as parents and the wedding party. I hope you understand. It's really just easier." I looked down at my card. It said Table 19. I looked at the seating chart on the wall behind her. Table 19 was in the back corner of the ballroom. I looked at the head table. It seated 8. Preston, Caroline, Preston's father, Preston's mother, my mother, the maid of honor, Ashley Ford, the best man, Preston's brother, and Ashley's boyfriend. There was no seat for me. I looked at Caroline. I did not say anything. I did not say anything, because in that moment, I understood something about my sister that I had, until then, refused to understand. I understood that Caroline had not, in fact, forgotten to include me. Caroline had made a choice. Caroline had decided, with the help of my mother, and possibly with the help of Vivienne Duquesne, that Grace Bellamy, the smart sister, the foreign service sister, the sister who wore Talbot's dresses to engagement parties, did not belong at the head table at a Whitfield wedding. I put the card in my purse. I said, "Caroline, where is Mom sitting?" Caroline said, "Mom is at the head table, silly." I said, "Right. And which of the tables is Grandma's?" Our grandmother, my father's mother, Ruth Bellamy, was 81 years old. She had flown in from a retirement community in North Carolina. She had raised the money for her plane ticket by selling her wedding china. Caroline said, "Grandma is at table 4, with the aunts." I said, "Okay, I'll see you at the dinner." I walked to the bar. I ordered a glass of white wine. I stood by myself, at the edge of the ballroom, and I looked at the head table where my sister and my mother and Preston's parents and Ashley Ford would sit the next night, and I understood, with a very quiet kind of clarity, what my life in this family had been for 20 years. I want to describe what happened next, because it is the reason for everything that followed. At approximately 6:30 p.m., a man walked over to me at the bar. He was in his late 60s, silver hair, a charcoal suit. He was holding a glass of bourbon. He said, "Excuse me, I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Harrison Whitfield. Judge Harrison Whitfield, Preston's father, the judge of the South Carolina Court of Appeals whose family had been in Charleston since 1798, and who had never, in 12 months of my sister's engagement, in the engagement party at his own home, in the 4 family dinners my sister had attended at his house, been introduced to me." I shook his hand. I said, "Judge Whitfield, I'm Grace Bellamy. I'm Caroline's sister." Judge Whitfield's face did not change. He was, I would learn later, a man who had spent 41 years on the bench, and he had trained his face to reveal exactly nothing. But his eyes moved. His eyes moved to the seating chart on the wall, the chart that showed the head table with no seat for me. His eyes moved to the little brass pin on the collar of my navy blue Talbot's dress, a small pin, in the shape of a stylized eagle, that I wore because I had, for 11 months, been carrying it in my purse, and had that morning, without thinking about it, put it on before I left the hotel. Judge Whitfield's eyes stopped on the pin. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, very quietly, "Ms. Bellamy, would you do me the honor of joining me at the bar for a moment? I have a question I would like to ask you, if I may." I said, "Of course, Judge." I followed him to the far end of the bar. He signaled the bartender. He ordered me another glass of wine. He said, still very quietly, "Ms. Bellamy, may I ask about your pin?" Saturday, I want to explain the pin, because it is the reason for everything. The pin was a meritorious honor award from the United States Department of State. It had been awarded to me in October of last year for my work on a specific matter I am not going to describe. It is not, on its own, a rare decoration. Roughly 600 are awarded each year, but the specific version of the pin I wore, a small variant with a red and gold enamel field behind the eagle, was awarded only to foreign service officers who had received the decoration in connection with what my agency calls operational work. There are, at any given time, perhaps 40 of us in the country. Judge Harrison Whitfield had, from 1997 to 2001, served as a legal advisor to the United States Mission to the United Nations. He had, during those 4 years, worked directly with senior foreign service officers. He knew the pin. He knew what it meant. He knew, roughly, what someone who wore it did for a living. I told him what I could tell him. I told him I was a foreign service officer. I told him I was currently on assignment in Washington. I told him I could not describe the work that had led to the decoration. Judge Whitfield listened. He asked me, carefully, in the way that men of a certain generation and profession ask these questions, one follow-up. He asked me who my supervising officer had been at my most recent overseas posting. I told him. It was a woman named Margaret Suarez. She had been the deputy chief of mission in Bogota when I was posted there in 2022. Judge Whitfield nodded slowly. He said, "Margaret Suarez, excellent officer. I had the pleasure of hosting her at a bar association event in Charleston in 2019. He took a sip of his bourbon. Then he said, "Ms. Bellamy, forgive me for the directness of the next question. I understand you are Caroline's sister. Am I correct that you have not been introduced to my wife?" I said, "No, Judge, I have not." He said, And am I correct that you are not seated at the head table for tomorrow's reception? I said, No, Judge. I am not. He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Miss Bellamy, I want you to know that Eleanor and I were not consulted on the seating arrangement. If we had been, this would not be the arrangement. I would like to speak with your sister before the dinner tonight. With your permission. I said, Judge, please don't, not tonight, not before the dinner. If Caroline is going to seat me where she has seated me, that is her choice. It is her wedding. I will not be the sister who forced a scene at the rehearsal dinner. Judge Whitfield looked at me for a long moment. He said, Miss Bellamy, your father was a Marine Corps pilot. If I recall Caroline's introduction of your mother correctly? I said, Yes, Judge. He was. Judge Whitfield said, May I ask what happened to him? I told him. Training accident. 2005. I was 12. Judge Whitfield said, I see. Ms. Bellamy, may I ask one further question? I said, Of course, Judge. He said, Who walked you into rooms in your family after your father died? I stopped. I did not answer for a moment. Then I said, Judge, nobody walked me into rooms. My father died when I was 12, and after that, the walking into rooms was reserved for my sister. Judge Whitfield nodded once. He said, Ms. Bellamy, would you allow me to do something tomorrow afternoon? I said, Judge, what? He said, Would you allow me, with your permission, and only if you will permit it, to walk you into the church tomorrow? Your father's daughter should be walked into a wedding by someone. It should have been your father. I am not your father. But I have been in a good many churches in my life, and I would be honored to walk you in. I did not answer for a very long time. Then I said, Judge Whitfield, are you sure? He said, Ms. Bellamy, I have been surer of very few things in my life. I said, Yes, Judge, I would be honored. He said, Then it is settled. Meet me at the corner of Meeting Street and Broad at 3:40 tomorrow. Do not tell anyone. He finished his bourbon. He walked back to Eleanor. I sat at the bar for another 20 minutes. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell my sister. I did not tell my grandmother. I went back to my hotel. I ironed my dress for the wedding. A pale gray silk dress I had bought at a small boutique in Alexandria 3 months earlier. I laid out my father's dog tags on the nightstand. I always traveled with them, in a small blue velvet pouch. I set my alarm for 8 a.m. I slept better than I had in a year. Saturday morning, I did not go to the bridal suite. I had not been invited. I went to breakfast at a small cafe near my hotel. I called my grandmother at her hotel. She and I had breakfast together. She wore her wedding pearls. She held my hand across the table. She said, Gracie, whatever happens today, you know what you know. I said, Yes, Grandma. She said, Your father would be proud of you. I said, I hope so, Grandma. At 3:35 p.m., I walked from my hotel to the corner of Meeting and Broad. I was wearing the pale gray silk dress. I was wearing my father's dog tags under the collar, where nobody could see them. I was wearing the small enamel pin. Judge Harrison Whitfield was standing on the corner. He was in a dove gray morning coat. He was holding a small bouquet of white roses. He handed the roses to me. He said, Miss Bellamy, you look beautiful, I said. Judge, thank you. He offered me his arm. We walked 1 block to St. Michael's Episcopal Church. Now, I want to describe what happened at the church door, because everyone in that story tells a slightly different version, and I want to give you mine. The Whitfield family was already inside. Eleanor had, per Charleston Episcopal tradition, been seated in the front pew. The guests were seated. The wedding was set to begin at 4 p.m. It was 3:52 p.m. Vivienne Duquesne was at the church door with her clipboard. She saw Judge Whitfield walking up the steps with a woman on his arm. Her face went through 3 expressions very quickly: recognition, confusion, and then, as she recognized me, a kind of professional horror. She said, Judge Whitfield, the processional is set. I have Grace on the list to be seated in the back. Judge Whitfield said, quietly, Vivienne, please add Miss Bellamy to the processional. She will walk in on my arm immediately before Caroline. If your list objects, please tell it that I have overridden it. Vivienne said, Judge Eleanor. Eleanor is already seated in the front. Judge Whitfield said, Vivienne, please. I am aware. Vivienne made a small choked sound. She stepped aside. At 3:59 p.m., the church organ began to play the processional. The doors of St. Michael's opened. The guests turned to look. The first person to enter was not my sister. The first person to enter was me. I was on Judge Harrison Whitfield's arm. The church was silent for approximately 4 seconds. 240 guests turned in their pews to see the bride, and instead saw the groom's father walking a woman none of them recognized. A woman in a pale gray dress, carrying a small bouquet of white roses, down the center aisle. Then the whispers started. Eleanor Whitfield turned around in the front pew. Her face went completely white. My mother turned around in the second pew. She had, I later learned, been listening to Ashley Ford tell a story about the bridal suite. She saw me. She stood up. She sat down. She stood up again. She sat down again. Judge Whitfield walked me. Slowly, deliberately, in the way a father walks a daughter down an aisle, to the front of the church. He stopped at the front pew. He turned to me. He said, quietly, "Ms. Bellamy, please be seated on my wife's right side. You are, from this moment forward, family." He seated me next to Eleanor. Eleanor could not speak. Judge Whitfield walked back to the church door. 2 minutes later, my sister Caroline entered the church on the arm of my Uncle Robert, my father's brother. She was radiant. She was beautiful. She walked halfway down the aisle before she looked to her right and saw me in the front pew, seated next to Eleanor Whitfield. Her step faltered. She did not stop. She continued to the altar. The ceremony proceeded. The reception, and after. I want to describe the reception briefly. My seating card had said Table 19. Judge Whitfield had, sometime between the ceremony and the reception, made a phone call to the country club. When I arrived at the ballroom, my seating card had been changed. I was seated at the head table, in the seat between Judge Whitfield and Eleanor Whitfield. Caroline did not speak to me during the reception. My mother did not speak to me during the reception. Eleanor Whitfield, 64 years old, Cabot of Beaufort, wife of the judge, mother of the groom, spoke to me during the reception for approximately 3 hours. She asked me about Bogota. She asked me about my mother. She asked me, at one point, in a very quiet voice, whether I was all right. I said, "Eleanor, I'm all right." She said, "Grace, may I say something to you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My husband told me before the ceremony what he was going to do. I want you to know that I would not have permitted it if I had not agreed with it. I have known your sister for a year. I did not know until this afternoon that she had a sister. I want to apologize to you, on behalf of my family, for not knowing you before this evening. That is a failing that belongs to more than one person in this room, and I would like to take my share of it." I said, "Eleanor, thank you." She said, "Grace, I would like to have you over to the house next time you're in Charleston. Would that be all right?" I said, "Yes, that would be all right." She patted my hand. At approximately 9:30 p.m., my grandmother walked over to the head table, 81 years old, in her wedding pearls, small and steady. She had watched the ceremony from a middle pew. She had seen the whole thing. She stopped at my chair. She put her hand on my shoulder. She said, in a voice that only I could hear, "Gracie, your father is here tonight. I can feel him." I could not speak. She kissed the top of my head. She walked back to table 4. Caroline and Preston left the reception at 10:15 p.m. for their departure limo. Caroline did not hug me goodbye. She did not look at me. I did not look at her. Preston, however, walked over to me before he left. He said, "Grace, I don't know what happened tonight. I know something happened. I want you to know that whatever it was, my parents seem to think you're family, which means I guess that you're my family now too. And I'm sorry we haven't met properly before now." I said, "Preston, congratulations. Take care of my sister." He said, "I will." He walked away. I flew back to Washington on Sunday morning. I have not spoken to my sister since the wedding. It has been 7 months. My mother called me in July. She wanted to explain the seating. I let her talk. She talked for 11 minutes. She said Vivienne had suggested the arrangement. She said Caroline had been overwhelmed. She said the head table had been small. She said she had assumed I would understand. When she was finished, I said, "Mom, I understand. I've understood for 20 years. Have a good summer." I hung up. I have not spoken to my mother since. My grandmother calls me every Sunday evening. She lives in her small apartment at the retirement community in North Carolina. We talk for 40 minutes. She tells me about the birds at her feeder. She tells me about the books she is reading. She has, twice in the last 7 months, told me the story of my father as a young man. Stories she had never told me before, because she had assumed my mother had told me. My mother had not. Judge Whitfield and Eleanor have had me to their house in Charleston twice. I have flown down for a weekend both times. Eleanor cooks Sunday supper. Judge Whitfield reads on the porch. They have introduced me, to their friends, as Preston's wife's older sister. She's foreign service. She's stationed in Washington. We're very fond of her. Preston and Caroline live in Charleston. I have not seen them since the wedding. I do not know if I will forgive my sister. I do not know if she has asked me to. But I know something now that I did not know before the wedding. I know that being unseen by the people who raised you is not the whole story. Sometimes, very rarely, in specific and quiet moments, you are seen, all at once, by a stranger, in a country club bar, because you were wearing a small pin your father would have recognized, and because a man who had also lost people, in his own way, understood what he was looking at. Judge Harrison Whitfield walked me into a church on the 7th of June because he saw me. That is the whole story. That is all I can tell you. If you have ever been the sister sat at the back table, if you have ever been the daughter who was smart, because she could not be the daughter who was chosen, I want you to leave one word in the comments below. Just one word. The name of the person who first walked you into a room the way you deserve to be walked in. It can be a parent, a stranger, a teacher, a friend, a spouse. Say their name, because someone in this comment section is going to see your word, and they are going to remember to be that person for someone else this week. And if this story reminded you that the family who sees you is not always the family whose blood you share, subscribe. Because next week, I am telling you about a boss who fired me in front of the board. The new CEO said my name first. I'll see you there.